You're listening to Two Guys Talking Wine with Michael Pinkus and Andre Prue.
Andre!
Michael!
We haven't done one of these in a long time.
What, one where everybody's remote, we're not in the same place?
Yeah, nobody's in the same place. You know, we're just looking at faces and everybody's background. You know, you see my hats, I see your door.
Yep.
Where you keep your child.
I do not keep my child in a closet. My child is not an aspiring wizard.
And our guest Stephen has a very nice looking place there. Wow, that's pretty. Is that a real back? Is that your real backdrop, Stephen?
That's my kitchen.
Okay, well, he's got the better look than all of us.
He definitely does. So our guest today is Stephen Ranger of Ranger Wines, and frankly, just a good dude. We've bumped into each other many times over the years, and the conversation has always been, we got to get you on the podcast. We got to get you on the podcast.
This has been like 3 or 4 years in the making. I think we send we bump into you once a year at a tasting somewhere, and we go, Steve, we got to get you on the podcast, and you anytime, and we talk about it. We go, okay, how about, no, we don't have time for that. And then, you know, it gets pushed down the road. So thank you, Stephen. Why don't you introduce yourself, what you do, and how people can reach you first of all, and then we'll get into what you do.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. And yeah, so my name's Stephen Ranger. I work in the wine world. I've got kind of what I would call 3 buckets of work. And the first is obviously my agency, Ranger Wine Inc., rangerwine.com if you're looking for a website. And I'm a little boutique agent, and I bring in wines that interest me from people that I really like. The criteria for those are they've got to be great. They've got to have, be family businesses, organic, sustainable, interesting, have a great story. Because I'm not trying to fill in gaps in a portfolio to have like a $25 Chianti and a $75 Brunello and, blah, blah, blah. I just want to work with, people I like and wines that I really believe in. The second bucket of work is I'm senior advisor at Iron Gate Auctions. And that's, been a real privilege to be involved with. Warren called me after I left my last company and said, will you help me start an auction house? And I said, absolutely. And it's just been going great guns, and it's a great team of people to work with. And the third bucket is I have, basically a consulting practice where I do a lot of appraisals, wine appraisals for estates, for divorces, for disasters, for, generally never the good stuff. And then I'm an auctioneer, and I go around the country and I do charitable auctions, wine, art, which is sort of my background. And that kind of covers me off for my working life.
Wow. That's 3 very interesting buckets, as you refer to them.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the 3Ds, because I remember I remember talking at one point to somebody about the 3Ds of when you need somebody to look at your wine list. It was divorce, debt, death, and then somebody added D&D at one point. You can't drink anymore, so you've got a drinking and driving charge. So as you said, it's all that.
Actually, the 4th D is really downsizing. And
okay, downsizing.
That's where where actually the majority of wines that come to auction, it comes as a result of that, less as a result of the 3 nasty Ds.
So that's really what we're bringing Stephen on for. Is Andre and I get a lot of questions about how much is this worth, how much is that worth, and mostly because we work in Ontario, it's about Ontario wine. So we can get into is there a secondary market in Ontario wine, and we all know the short answer to that. But tell us a little bit about auctions and how people get involved in them.
Sure. Well, wine auctions are a relatively new creature in Ontario, and there have been charitable auctions around for about 30, 40 years, actually. I think the Toronto Symphony Orchestra was like the first. But commercial auctions didn't happen in Ontario until 2001. And I was, vice president at Ritchie's Auctioneers at the time, and really super interested in wine. And part of my job was basically to develop new categories, business units. And so, being a wine guy, I asked the question, why don't we have commercial wine auctions in Ontario? And the short answer was because nobody had tried, and nobody really wanted to get into bed with the LCBO. So I started knocking on their door, and basically they told me to, go pound sand. And they were much more interested in working with, Sotheby's or Christie's. And I said, oh, okay, well, knowing full well that Sotheby's and Christie's are not going to work with the LCBO. And 2 years later, I found a receptive person there, a guy named Barry O'Brien, and we put together a partnership and put together the very first auction. It was 2001, and we held it at the Design Exchange in Toronto. And there it kind of took off. Our first auction, we thought we had $1 million worth of wine. Turned out we had $2 million worth of wine by the time the hammer all fell, because there was this huge, huge pent-up demand. So, flash forward to today, there's kind of three auctioneers working in the wine space: Waddington's in Ontario, Yegor de Hippolyte in Quebec, and then Irongate, which is based in Alberta, but is essentially a national auction house because their reach is across the country. And Irongate's able to do that because of being based in Alberta. When we were looking for a place to sort of set up shop, we knew that Ontario would have been a no-go. I'd been knocking on BC's door forever, but there was always some problem, always some issue. And then we went to Alberta and said, look, we want to start a business here, a fine wine auction. It's going to be a national auction house, and we'd love to be here. And they said, what's the fastest way to yes?
That's
after, right? Yeah, after Warren and I picked our, I should say Warren Porter is our president of Irongate. After we picked our jaws up off the floor, we said, okay. So 5 years later, here we are. And, we're doing 5 commercial auctions of wine, 5 commercial auctions of spirits a year, plus a big charitable benefit auction. And I have to say that, in all modesty, we're killing it. It's, everything is kind of done to the very highest international standards. We're getting prices that meet or exceed the international market in most categories. And that's because we work in a closed market here in Canada. It's really that simple. Canadians don't have access, or they can have access to wines from international auction houses, but they either have to store it in that country where they bought it, or bring it back at great expense and risk. And then, of course, pay the currency differential, which these days is, as you guys both know, pretty tough.
Yep. I just picked up some euros for my brother for Christmas, who's taking his family to Rome next year. Mm-hmm. And it was pretty painful to see how much 100 euros cost.
Yeah. Yeah. Probably like $160 or something like that, right?
Yep. Exactly what it is.
Yeah.
So I guess the question I have, just so we're not putting too much the cart before the horse, like the LCBO has their hands in every part of alcohol sales. Like it surprises many people when I tell them that even with the ADX Wine Company, every sale that I make, a portion of that goes through the LCBO. How do the auctions work in terms of, I've put a really great bottle of Rare Bordeaux up and it's sold for $2,000. Does the LCBO take a cut of that once the wine is sold?
Where did you sell it? Did you sell it with Irongate, or did you sell it somewhere else?
Well, let's say I sold it with Waddington's in Ontario, and then you can tell me how things work with Irongate.
Sure. Yeah. I don't know the financial arrangements that Waddington's has with the LCBO, but I would assume that the LCBO does take a cut. And because we sell wine out of Alberta, We don't pay a commission to Alberta, but we pay all our taxes out there and we employ people. Whether that sort of impacts it, where we are doesn't really kind of impact, because what we're selling people's personal property. Yes, it's wine, and the property changes hands in the province of Alberta and then is shipped by common carrier. And that is how we are able to legally service our clients across the country.
Okay.
So, as I said at the beginning, a lot of people ask us, for auctions, what are the wines that people are buying for auctions? Many people have heard of Bordeaux auctions. Is there a market for Burgundy still? Is there a market for Bordeaux still? Bordeaux is in a little bit of free fall for selling new wines, but old wines.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the new wines coming out of Bordeaux. Yeah, there's issues, and you guys have talked about them on your podcast. What I'll say is that the wine auction trade, the foundation of it is class growth Bordeaux, and has been, always will be. Burgundy is right up there, and there's a huge market for it. The bloom is slightly off the rose post-pandemic. During the pandemic, people were paying insane prices for, DRC and Rousseau and, the great producers. And now it's kind of, leveled out. I wouldn't say bubble burst, because it's still, prices are insane, but it's not what it was Q1 2022, which was sort of the height of the Burgundy boom. Then, of course, Super Tuscans and Italian wines, there's always a market at those for auction, especially in Ontario, where we have, such a huge Italian population, or people of Italian descent anyway, as well as just Italian wine lovers. Spain, a little bit, and, port, a little bit. Port's always sort of like the poor cousin of the wine auctions, because, port sells for fractional amounts at auction. And then, of course, there's California, which the demand for California wine, the tariff war notwithstanding, is very, very consistent and has a huge loyal collector base across the country and obviously and around the world. I would say, you're less likely to find California wines that come up in European auctions, but you certainly see them in Hong Kong auctions. Which is sort of like the other big center. But, the biggest market for wine auctions in the world is still the U.S. There's 5 major houses all competing for business. But it's a pretty big pie.
Yeah. Look, I do wine tours, and it's amazing how many people, Canadians and Americans who come up here and for wine tasting and stuff like that, they still, there's still a thirst for California, even though, as you said, with the tariff war, there are people crying the blues that they can't pick up their California wine.
Yeah. Yeah, as well they should. No pun intended, but, fine wine is like the low hanging fruit on the tariff war,
Yeah, totally.
And, obviously, because California and Oregon or Washington are all blue states, there's no real appetite on the part of the Trump administration in order to kind of lean in and maybe say, hey, can you give our winemakers a break?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's all polished. I mean, it's the same thing. Same thing in Canada too, with regard to the limitations on our producers here. But that's a whole separate story for another time. I've heard the word NAFTA thrown around. It's just like the governments treat the wine industry, just almost as an afterthought. Like, they don't take it seriously that this could generate a lot of money for the government,
or as a cash cow, right? Like, that's what are you going to do? You're going to let's up the sin tax. Right. So, cigarettes, alcohol, that's how you make more money, is to put more money on the backs of winemakers. Breweries are now trying to fight the bottle, the tax on beer at the moment. It's kind of crazy what you throw on the backs of all these, booze makers.
Yeah, sure. It's a way over-regulated industry. And if we were less regulated, we'd all make more money. We'd all be happier. But, I think you touched on it, Michael, when you said the sin tax. And also nobody feels particularly, sorry for wealthy wine collectors who can't get their bottle of Screaming Eagle.
Yeah. So bringing the conversation to the question that Michael's been dancing around a couple of times. This past weekend, I went and visited a friend of mine who bought a house in North Toronto. Had a very nice wine cellar in the basement. It wasn't fully humidity controlled, but it looked like it was pretty consistent temperatures, underground, like crawl space basement. And she handed me a bottle of Inniskillen VQA 1989 Saval Blanc. How much money is that bottle going to be worth at your auction?
We wouldn't even take it. We wouldn't take it. Yeah.
See this. So the question, I guess, Andre is going to, what is the secondary market for Ontario wine?
Okay. There, with very few and like literally a handful of exceptions, there isn't one. And there isn't one because we don't have the sort of long history of quality that would warrant, wines coming into the collectible category. As you are probably aware, 98% of all wines that get made in Ontario get drunk within the first year. There's very few what I would call long-term cellar-worthy wines that we make in Canada. Now, I think that's changing, which I think, I believe 100% in Canadian wines. I think what we're doing in BC and Ontario is amazing, and I drink those wines on a regular basis. Have they found their way into the secondary market yet? Not really, because the secondary market is so focused on, those big categories that I rattled off earlier, Bordeaux and Burgundy and Champagne and California, Italy. And we haven't kind of really made the dent yet. Now, where that could change is, some of the smaller boutique wineries that are coming along, and on initial release, their wines are, $100 to $150. Now, that is about the minimum value that you could put a wine into auction for these days. And certainly with us at Irongate, it's just, we can't afford to sell anything less than that because it costs an enormous amount to get a bottle of wine, from the consignor's house all the way through the process into the buyer's hands at the end of the day. So yeah, we're not there yet in Ontario in terms of the secondary market. I know that, and you guys probably know as well as I do, that there's a huge gray market that exists for, vintage Ontario wines that change hands between collectors. But how big a market that is, I have absolutely no idea.
See, I think you were being very generous in the industry to say that it's a huge market, and I think I appreciate just how carefully you worded everything. I want to make it very clear to people listening to this podcast, because Ontario wine lovers are quite fanatical, and I know there's some people on here who are the biggest cheerleaders. No one should be mad at Stephen. He's in the business of making money, and he knows that there's no market for this wine, and this is something where I'm in full agreement with him as well, as someone who owns a business in this province and has skin in the game. So please, no angry emails to Stephen about the fact that my bottle of Saval would not be accepted at the auction.
Well, look, I've been a cheerleader for years. I collect Ontario wine. I know, Andre, you've got a vertical of Trius Red.
I do, going back to 2010.
That at one point you said to me, "Oh, it's going to be worth something one day," and I said, "No." And
I've smartened up since then. I probably said that back when, in 2016, when I had the vertical up to 6 years worth. But now that I've got it, and I have a cellar where if I brought Steven in to appraise it, I know isn't worth anything. But I also know that there's some stuff in my cellar that all three of us would be very happy to drink. There's good wines
oh.
in there. They're just not worth anything.
It's absolutely.
Well, okay, 100%. And here's the thing, you look at, there was an estate collection that I've been in the midst of handling, over the last week or so. And of the 1,200 bottles in that collection, 300 of them we're not able to take. And those 300 include, yes, some Ontario wines, but it also includes things like really good Chianti Classicos and some Barolos and some Chardonnay de Papes, because the auction market, the commercial auction market, is about the top end. It's it's not about, kind of wines for everyday drinking under $100. That's not why people go to either buy or even sell at auction. It's all about that top end. And it's no slap in the face of, the wines from Ontario or Chardonnay de Pape or Chianti or, Australia or wherever. Look at how much great wine is made in Australia. There are really only a handful of wines that are considered collectible from Australia. And it starts with Grange and it's, goes to Henschke, Hill of Grace, a few others like that. But it's certainly not as robust. Now, I'm going to say that there is a robust secondary market in Australia for Australian wine. Now, maybe Canadians need to get off their butts, and maybe somebody's brave or stupid or crazy or just brilliant enough to say, you know what, I'm going to start an auction house and I'm going to focus on Ontario and BC wine and sell it only within the country. And they could deal with the LCBO and the BC Liquor Board and, good luck. But, it's the same thing. But, 15 years ago, when I worked in the art auction business for 30 years, that's my background. I started, an auction that was dedicated to Canadian contemporary art, finding a secondary market for Canadian contemporary art. And it was really only partially successful. A handful of artists kind of rose to the top and did well, but the vast majority of them did not. And that's just because it was a market that was still really nascent. It was still gallery based, like winery, the wine business is winery based. And it hasn't sort of kind of spread itself out among the population or crept into our consciousness that we need to support things like Canadian contemporary art or Canadian wine.
Andre, in full disclosure, I do some work for Iron Gate. I've done some work for Stephen where I catalog wine cellars that they're either going to take or whatever like that is, and it's not when you're cataloging it. Yeah, you look at them and you go, oh, that first growth would probably be nice to drink, but it's some of the stuff that for sure they're not going to taste. That they're not going to go to auction. That you go, oh, that's not going to sell for anything. But man, that would be a really great bottle just to open and pour a glass and see if it's still alive. Those are the interesting ones. But they're definitely they're not going to be going to auction.
Yeah, the key to wines that do come to auction is that they have to have impeccable provenance. They have to have been stored well. They can't be fakes, obviously. And, fraud has, as you probably know, is, rife in the wine world. Mm-hmm. It's all about the top tier wines. Of course, you probably remember the story of that chap, Rudy Kurnawan, who was the famous wine forger, in the US, who ended up doing a lot of time. And, but it shook up the wine world in a big way and opened people's eyes up to, provenance is really key. It's got to be kept well. It's got to come from a good source. You have to be able to, in some cases, in 99.9%, we need to see the cellar, the pictures of the cellar before we'll accept wines for auction.
Which is why Canada is such a great market, because we only have in each province, we only have the one cellar. Yeah. For the most part of fine wine.
Yeah. There's less fraud in Canada, in the Canadian market for wine, than there is certainly proportionately in anywhere else in the world.
So they're backhanded. We just said something nice about our liquor monopolies.
Yeah, kind of.
Well, I mean, that's something I've said where it is one of the like few good things we have is that you can buy with confidence because they're dealing with the source directly for the most part.
You know what's really interesting though is that in Toronto and Ontario in particular, you used to be able to go to the States to Rochester or Buffalo and go buy wine and bring it back at very, very little cost. And a lot of the kind of older sellers from, collectors of a certain generation, you see like boxes stamped with Century Liquors from Rochester and, things like that. And that provenance is really good, because people were going down there like literally, on the weekends and stocking up or even buying their futures through there because the LCBO futures program didn't, really begin in earnest until 20 odd years ago.
Wow. So the question I have then is like reading between the lines and a lot of the brands that you've mentioned by name, like things like Penfolds, Grange, like these are wines that are out of reach for most average consumers.
Yeah.
And, we talked a bit on the podcast, like I'm excited about some of my Bordeaux futures coming in this year, but the most expensive bottle is a bottle of Trot Vieille, which is a Premier Grand Cru Class A that's coming in for $161. But is that Trot Vieille? Would that ever be worth anything if I store it properly?
100%, yeah.
So I guess the question is like, is it possible to get into wine collecting where I am hoping to drink these and I am planning on drinking these, but like let's just say down the road I have built a substantial collection. I want to get rid of some bottles. What is sort of the entry level to start collecting where I might see a little bit of a return on investment?
Yeah, it's in and around $150 to $200 a bottle.
Okay.
Yeah, that's kind of entry level, high end collecting, and then of course it works its way up into the stratosphere. Interestingly enough, like there are a lot of, when you go back in time, a lot of the people who were buying, wines in the 80s and into the 90s, and were paying, $300 for Margaux or Mouton, or even in the super seconds, Rosansegla or Palmer, they have appreciated greatly. Now, here's the thing, like art, not every wine appreciates in value. And even if it has good provenance, or even if it's a Bordeaux, if it's a class growth, you're pretty confident that it's going to at least maintain its value to a certain degree. If you buy it now and then want to sell it in 5 years, not so much. But wine is a long-term hold for people. And so there's a lot of talk about wine as an, alternative asset. And in the same way that art is discussed as an alternative asset. And, I think it's kind of put out there by people who have a vested interest in seeing it being an alternative asset. It takes time, a ton of patience, and a level of connoisseurship that requires, real diligence if you are going to actually make, a good return on a wine investment.
So I want to see if I'm going to burst Andre's bubble here. Sorry, Andre, but I got to check this out. Hold on. Tell me, Stephen, what is the secondary market on most Chardonnay, or is there Chardonnays that are really worth something in the future?
Yeah. Well, okay. Obviously we start in Burgundy.
Yeah, there's a tiny little Grand Cru vineyard has Montrachet in the name and various iterations of it, and I have a feeling that the list is very short after that.
Yeah, and then it's California.
Oh,
right? Yeah, definitely. Like California shards, like the Kistlers and the Hansens and stuff like that.
All the ones you don't like, Andre.
Yeah, all the ones I don't like from California.
Yeah, all the big buttery oaky Chardonnays from California. No,
see, but that's the thing is with the market changing now, and like for the taste of Chardonnay, and we're seeing this like globally, a pullback on use of oak and the flavor profile evolving. I'm curious because the people who are chasing that profile of Chardonnay are literally in the demographic that are dying off.
Yeah,
So,
but they're also in the demographic that has a lot of money.
right now, though, right? Because
Right
I'm talking about
now.
buying. If I bought a Kistler right now for auction in 20 years, like this, I guess this is the risk that comes with buying any sort of asset is this one could be worthless if the market doesn't exist in 20 years.
100%. And, but look at, a Grand Cru Chablis, right? Those like, Ravenel wines, they just consistently get better and better and better. Mind you, using white Burgundy as an example is a tough one because through the 90s, there was a lot of that pre-mock stuff that kind of came into the market that, literally, 5 years in the bottle and it was pretty much over. But I from what I understand, like the Burgundians have a much better handle on that.
Sorry, Andre. I just had to find out what 70% of your cellar was worth.
Yeah, but I've already said though, like I know my cellar's worthless, but there's a lot of great
Yeah,
wines to
of
drink,
course.
and that's the purpose of having it. I think that's like I said, like why I put out the disclaimer to make sure no one gets angry at Stephen is we're not talking about being a wine lover, right? We're talking about the dollars and cents of this. That's what the conversation is. So
yeah, exactly. And I'd say the same thing about my collection, right? That I buy things that I want to drink, and I want to drink in 5 years. I don't have a long-term kind of 10, 20-year plan. If I was 45, I might have, but at this point in my life, no, I buy things I want to drink sooner rather than later. Like many people, as you get older, your palate changes. I don't want big, thick, syrupy wines, whether they be white or reds. I don't want, 15.5% declared on the label, so I agree. But if you look at, just to give, kind of a odd example here, and you brought it up earlier, Michael, what's coming out of Bordeaux these days, even with climate change, they're dialing back the alcohol in a big way because they know that the consumers' tastes are changing and consumers want to be able to, experience things younger, fresher. And so I think, those wines, when they kind of start making their way to auction in 10, 15 years, are going to be really interesting to see how they've evolved, the kind of the younger, fresher. Now, does that translate into aging in the cellar? We'll certainly see.
You're also going to see a fair bit of white Bordeaux. It's going to be especially nowadays. We're seeing, when I was there in January, a lot of the producers were starting to talk about, we're either going to make white Bordeaux under the AOC or we're going to make it outside of the AOC. But and these are big houses that weren't allowed to make white, and they're going to start making them. So.
Well, interestingly, a lot of the Sauterne producers are now making dry whites as well because they can't sell Sauterne.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many bottles a month of Sauterne you drink, Michael. Probably a lot more than me, maybe 4, 5, 6. But
as much, and as much ice wine as well, right? So
exactly, yeah. So, but and those wines are sensational.
Yes, they are. Oh, yeah.
But white Bordeaux is a category at auction that you just don't see a lot of because not a lot was produced.
So, Stephen, I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball at the moment.
Oh, I was about to ask the exact question. I was going to use those exact same words, Michael, but you go
Okay,
ahead.
So, let's see if our crystal ball questions are going to be the same.
You're spending too much time together, guys. I can tell.
Yep, definitely.
So, having spent some time in Bordeaux in January, and then getting reports from Krister, who is my Bordeaux source, I guess the price of Bordeaux in some sectors went down 30% for the new stuff this year, or as much as 30%. Do you see Bordeaux continuing to hold its value going forward, or are we going to see a leveling off and a more come to Jesus moment for Bordeaux that the prices are not going to stay that high?
Okay, so I guess you're talking about new release wines as opposed to secondary market wines?
Well, I guess both, because
because you're making this purchase as an investment, and the fact that a bottle of Colon Segura or whatever.
Sure.
Let's say a bottle now is like 30% cheaper this year than it was last year.
So is it better to buy it now because it's cheaper, or is it going to rise again, or?
Look, if you've been hanging around the Bordeaux wine trade for any length of time, you know that they are very, very, very good business people. And they read a room pretty fast. They read a market pretty fast. Now, sometimes it takes them a little while to respond, but they see it coming. And, like there's negociants there who are holding like tons of wine from the 22, 23 vintage, from the 21 vintage, which wasn't that good. And so those wines are going to like come out onto the market. They're going to be less expensive. Now, if it's a class growth, generally those wines are going to stay high in price. It's all the other stuff. It's the Cru Bourgeois, the Bordeaux Supérieur, the kind of, the Côte de Blaise, the Côte de Bordeaux, those things are going to come down. And, but they're not auction wines anyway, those wines really for the most part. And interestingly enough, Saint-Emilion, there are a lot of Grand Crus in Saint-Emilion that, maybe shouldn't be, Grand Crus, but, they have that, acclamation. Even those wines, they don't really hit it at auction as well either. But that's where I think consumers can probably find really, really good value, right? Is in those, the Saint-Emilion Grand Crus, the Cru Bourgeois, but are they going to be auction wines ever? Hard to tell. Hard to tell at this point.
I just love the politics of the Saint-Emilion Grand Cru classification, and the bickering and the pettiness is just, if there's one job I would never want, it would be to be on anything to do with the board that takes care of that classification. Because I think the moment you set foot in the door of the office, a lawsuit shows up on your desk.
I think some of them are pulling out of the whole system and of the AOC system. And
well, Cheval Blanc is no longer, and they were like the top for the longest time.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a number of them that are, and they're doing that for a ton of different reasons too. It's not, it's a lot of it is, they want to be able to use some grapes that'll stand up to the heat, and they're not allowed to. And we think we're over-regulated here. Look at the Bordeaux, look at the Bordelaise, look at the French generally. What you're allowed to grow, it's pretty strict. Unless you're happy labeling it as Vin de France.
Yeah, it's Andre. That's why I ask, when we speak to French and Italian winemakers, what grape would you grow if you could grow it? Like if you were allowed to grow it? Because it's amazing how many, just like one of the guys we had said, I would grow Pinot if I could.
Well, and it's in the middle of a cultural shift, and it's I think it's generational as well, because I do think there are a lot of producers who are in love with the tradition because they think it helps maintain the strength of the brand. And to a certain extent, yes. But if your wines start to suck because of what's happening on the planet, your brand isn't going to hold its value, right? Because ultimately the label is one thing, but the quality of the juice still matters, even if you're making a purchase as an investment, because somewhere down the road, someone is going to open that bottle. And it still has to be good. And it is interesting to see how the changes are taking place.
I don't know if that's true. And Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong. Like even some of Bordeaux's worst vintages, if it gets old enough, it's worth something.
Yes and no. People are very particular about vintages in many cases. So, a 2011 Calon Segur is going to be worth a lot less than a 2010 Calon Segur. And it's going to have a much shorter lifetime than the 2010. And, savvy collectors are very much aware of that. They're not just buying brand. They're buying vintage too. They're buying provenance. They're buying all of it.
But if you're like, let's say you're a collector that is looking at a vertical, even if it was a bad vintage, you're going to pay just to fill in the gaps of your vertical.
But I guess to my earlier point, you're not going to have to pay as much.
Yeah.
So
So just a quick question about like we said, let's make this a little bit more positive. I've got my Chocolat Vieille showing up. Let's just say I don't decide to open it. I have my.
Oh, you're opening it, damn you!
Oh, I totally am. But I'm painting a hypothetical. I'm really excited to open it, and we'll probably tell another story about that in another episode. But I've got my basement in Hamilton. Usually gets as warm as 18 degrees in the summer. Gets a little cooler in the winter, but never much cooler than 15. I've got a little humidity monitor, so I can see like the humidity doesn't get below 30 in there. Let's just say hypothetically I do want to send that wine to auction at some point and you have to assess it. What sort of documentation do I need to demonstrate how the wine has been stored, and how are you able to determine whether or not me as a potential consigner is being fully honest in how the wine was stored?
Well, of course we go a lot on trust. We also, we do trust and verify. So we'd want to look at your cellar. And if you were honest with us and said, yeah, it's been kept in a natural cellar, it's, top end 18 at most, lowest 15. I would look at the wines there and I would think that, there's kind of like a 10-year cap on anything that's coming out of Andre's cellar.
Okay.
I think you're a little hot, Andre, I think is what it is.
Yeah, you're a little warm. If you had said 17, low of 14, I'd feel a little differently. But 18, it's kind of getting a little warm for me for a long-term hold. And so then we'd have a very straightforward conversation. And, can I take this? Maybe not. And if you brought something older out of your cellar, we'd be looking at it really carefully. We'd probably want to take a sample bottle and see how it, do a Coravan with it just to see how it's doing. And sample a number of bottles from your collection just to make sure that, it maybe didn't creep up to 22 that year. It got to 40 degrees.
So if somebody had like a single bottle, like I've seen that on Facebook Marketplace, somebody's got a single bottle of.
People are always calling me about that. Yeah, we don't take them.
Yeah, you need quantity, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and chances are if somebody just has one bottle, that means they are highly unlikely to have ideal storage conditions, or even necessarily a wine fridge. Someone gave me this bottle of Tiganello 10 years ago, and we've kept it. We didn't want to open it, and now we realize it's worth $250. Can you sell it for us? I'm sorry, I can't. No.
Yeah, I was teaching a wine class once, and they had this 20-year-old bottle of Krug, but then after I started talking to them about it, they found out that they had left it in a hutch that had been in the sun. And then they found out it was worth something. Can I help them put in touch with somebody? I go, yeah, put it in touch with your fridge and maybe give it a try. But it's probably not going to be worth anything or taste very good.
Yeah. The ideal cellar, as you know, it's, 17 degrees, 16 degrees, 15 degrees, and doesn't really, move, more than a degree or two down over the course of a year, and has, decent humidity. The reason you see such variations in wines, older wines, is because of storage, 90% of it is storage.
So you've told us about the temperature, humidity. What should humidity be at?
50, 60 is good.
Oh, see, there you go, Andre. You only have 30% down there.
No, I said that's as low as it gets. It's usually higher than that, but I was just more painting the picture. My takeaway from this conversation is like the whole idea of making money on, the bottle of wine that you find in your friend's basement that they give to you doesn't really exist. So if someone gives you a single bottle of Cheval Blanc, a single bottle of 82 Cheval Blanc, take it home and open it, or you might be able to find a private person to sell it to, but it's not like finding a pot of gold somewhere. And then the other thing that you're telling me as well. So I actually, over the course of this conversation, I pre-registered for the next Iron Gate Fine Wine auction is, as someone now who's getting more curious, is as someone who wants to drink wine, this might be an opportunity for me to skip the steps of having to age wine myself. Now understanding the process of how you curate what ends up in the auction, I think there's an opportunity for, an enthusiast who can maybe afford some of these wines to get a chance to, really discover them.
Well, buying wine at auction is, and I know this sounds really, elitist as hell. It's actually a bargain. You will pay way less than you will for a new release class growth wine at auction than you will at retail than you would at auction. So, it's again, you have to kind of put in the work in a way, like navigating a 1,200 lot wine auction. And we have tools that help people do that kind of help refine what you're looking for. I'm only interested in Bordeaux. I'm only interested in Burgundy. I'm only interested in, the great wines of Finland. And you can kind of narrow that,
I love that you picked a country that there's no way a grapevine would.
Here's their one bottle that's there, and you're like, what is that?
Yeah. So it requires a proactive consumer. And it's not just like going to Lickbo and saying, yeah, I want the best bottle of wine you have. No, you really have to kind of put in some work. And that's who our buyers are. They are hugely passionate, knowledgeable people. And, we learn as much from them as they learn from us. And that's one of the great things about, my job is working with these collectors who've, been building their knowledge in their collection for 40, 50 years. And, and now they're willing to share it, it's a very personal, wine collecting, like all serious collecting, is a very personal thing.
Well, I apologize for bringing the intelligence of the room down, having registered for the next auction. I know you said intelligent consumers. I'm certainly not doing anything to help the IQ in the room, but I'll do my best. I know it has been fun to window shop for sure. So I'm looking forward to seeing what's coming up for auction.
Yeah. The November auction is beautiful. It's going to be a big auction, so you'll have to use all the filtering tools.
I can see the photo that you have for the auction it looks like a lot of DRC Domenica Romani Conti with is this an actual lot from the auction, or is it artwork that's there?
It's most likely a lot.
Okay, so with the Romani Saint Vival, Latache, Romani Conti, Echezeaux, and it looks like two Echezeaux. So I don't know. We'll see how much.
Can you read the year off that, Andre?
Let's take a look. 1986.
Well, there you go.
Wow, beautiful. Yeah, well, those we those are banner lots, right? It's not all Romani Conti and Mouton and Haut-Brion. There's a lot of other really great wines that are, anywhere between 150 and 250 a bottle. They're often in 2 or 3 or 4 bottle lots. So they're accessible to, a pretty wide range of collectors. That's for sure.
Well, Stephen, we'd like to thank you for giving us the time and finally getting, I'd like to thank Andre and I for finally, being smart enough to get you on the podcast.
Well, it's one of those things where I never expect us to learn anything, but I actually, I learned everything I wanted to know about what's in my basement right now, including the drinking window. And the thing is, the good news is there is no bubbles burst, which means, frankly, Michael, at least I've learned a lot more from thinking that my vertical of Trius Red's ever going to be worth anything. But the good news is it means I'm going to open that vertical of Trius Red at some time, rather than bugging Steven 5 years down the road when he comes to my cellar and says, these wines are too old, your cellar's too warm, and you should have drank these 10 years ago.
And my job is to actually tell you that in the nicest possible way, Andre.
Oh, you certainly did it nicer than Michael would have. Let's put it that way.
That's for sure.
Drink that son of a bitch.
So thanks again to Stephen Ranger. Make sure you check the show notes. We'll link to his agency. He does have some very interesting niche wines that are for sale. And I'm Andre Prue at Andre Wine Review on social media. Support us on Patreon, patreon.com/2guystalkingwine.
Andre, I'm glad you learned something. I always feel good when you do.
Did you learn anything? A
little bit.
Okay.
Having worked in the industry, I knew a lot of what Stephen was talking about. And I've worked with Warren and I've worked with Stephen, so I ask a lot of questions while I'm there. I'm Michael Pinkus of MichaelPinkusWineReview.com, the great guy on most social media. Thank you very much, and as always, good night.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to Two Guys Talking Wine on iTunes.
Two Guys Talking Wine is produced by Adam Duran and Ken Little.